Coming out tonight, and there may be some more folks that might drift in over the next few minutes, but in the interest of time and the fact that there is a UNC basketball game on tonight, we'll try to go ahead and get started. I wanted to tell you about the upcoming March event. I'm pretty excited about that because I won't be speaking here. We're going to have a guest speaker for that, and the guest speaker is Mr. Murdoch Morrison, who is St. Andrews class of '69. He is the great-grandson of Murdoch Morrison, who owned the Morrison Gun Factory here at Laurel Hill. And he's going to give a history of that family, which dates all the way back to Scotland, Scottish immigrants, Buchanans, and Morrisons, who were gunsmiths in Scotland prior to coming here. And he's also going to be bringing one of the 3 known surviving examples of the Morrison rifle. So that will be a really good one to be at, and one not to be missed, to have a chance to see that rifle that was made here in Scotland County. So March 12th.
Bill Purcell II
Yep.
has got a Buchanan rifle.
That's got the other one. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's one of the 2, one of the 3 that comes from that family. But nonetheless, thanks again for coming out tonight, and I hope that the little teaser that I put out there, I hope that you won't be let down after this evening's presentation, because this is a story that I sort of happened upon, have seen some references to through the years, but once I did a deep dive, which began about 5 years ago, it really, truly is, in my mind, the greatest story that's never been told from this area. For me, it engages everything that I'm interested in. It engages the history of Scottish immigration. It addresses the use of Scots Gaelic. It addresses the Civil War. It addresses local Presbyterian history. It just has everything all into one. And I'm really excited to be able to share what I know about this with you tonight. I will preface this by saying that I owe several people some thanks who have provided some additional research for this. 2 ladies that I couldn't help but at least acknowledge, because I think there might be some video footage taken. I must acknowledge Amy Dahm and Phyllis Arnold, who are great-great-grandnieces of our character tonight, who I serendipitously happened upon, and who provided a great deal of research, who were very anxious to find out more about the connections of their colonial ancestor in this area. I hosted them during the time of COVID and after, where they were able to set foot on places where their family had spent time, and it was a truly meaningful sort of thing for all of us during that time that we were sort of sequestered and locked up. But we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let me begin. Again, the greatest story never told, the saga of the Reverend James Sinclair. We obviously have to start our story with the man's father. John Campbell Sinclair was born on the island of Tiree around 1797. He's educated at the universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, as were most high ministers of the day. He became a minister in the Secession Church of Scotland in 1822. The Secession Church was not the Church of Scotland. It was sort of a split off from the Church of Scotland. The people that were in the Secession Church were people that believed that they ought to be able to select and choose their own ministers, and not simply have ministers which were appointed for them by local landowners and things like that. The Secession Church was somewhat the denomination that eventually became the Free Church of Scotland after the split in 1843. John Campbell Sinclair married Julia McLean of the island of Mull in 1822, and she was very closely related to the Dewart families of McLean. In fact, in later years, the family published a rather extensive history showing their relationships to the McLeans of Dewart. I've heard from some that there's some inaccuracies in that, but nonetheless, it's a bit that they really were very proud of. The couple had 5 children. James, who's the subject of this talk, was born in 1827, the oldest. Margaret was born in 1830. Annie was born in 1832. She went on to become a very prominent Presbyterian church laywoman in later years. Alexander was born in 1832. He eventually became the minister of the First Presbyterian Church of Charlotte during the Civil War. And Peter, who served in the Confederate Army, resigned his commission, and later operated a pro-Confederate newspaper in Fayetteville. All of them were born in Scotland. And as you see here, in the life of John Campbell Sinclair, in 1838, the family immigrates first to Pictou, Nova Scotia, then to Prince Edward Island, where John serves a congregation there and serves speaking Gaelic for about 14 years. In 1852, John makes the trip to the United States for the first time. And once again, here's Tyree, the home of the Sinclairs there. As you see, there's Island of Skye. Here's Oban, our sister city. So west of there, somewhat isolated, sort of one of the more outlying of the Inner Hebrides. And then sailing to Pictou, Nova Scotia, and eventually settling in Prince Edward Island by 1838. So across the ocean they came from Tyree to the Canadian Maritimes, where a good number of Scottish immigrants did end up. Son James is married in 1846 to a woman named Mary McPherson. She's obviously a Gael from Prince Edward Island. They have 2 children that are born there, Julia in 1847 and James John. We think he could have been a junior, was born in 1848. In any event, in 1852, John Sinclair, the father, moves his family to Massachusetts after visiting the United States for the first time. And he wants to see his children have the educational opportunities that they can find here in the United States. He's terribly impressed on his first visit in the New England states, and he's interested in having his sons being educated either at Princeton or at the Western Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. Son James has his 3rd child, a son Alexander, who's born in Pennsylvania, perhaps during or just previous to the beginning of his education at the Western Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. In 1854, John's sons James and Alexander both enter the seminary, and the family moves to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. John is employed, Father John, that is, the father of the 2 sons, is employed by the American and Foreign Christian Mission Union as a missionary, and he serves a church in Pittsburgh for a little less than a year. John's wife dies that year, and that may perhaps have some impact on why he and his sons decided to relocate to North Carolina. So the question becomes, from Pennsylvania, why North Carolina? I'll move to the next slide. If I haven't misplaced myself here. Here we go. There we go. All right. The Reverend Colin McEver is a native of Stornoway in the island of Lewis, and he's ministered in the Fayetteville Presbytery since about 1809. He'd come over as a teacher in the area, but was ordained by the Presbytery in 1809, just after arriving, and he serves for 40 years as one of the primary Gaelic-speaking ministers in this region, and one of the last of the Scottish-born ones. There were American-born Gaelic ministers within the area that was serving as well. Now, he ministered at Barbecue and other churches, Galatia, Longstreet, pretty much throughout the old Fayetteville Presbytery. But after he passed in 1850, there was a void left, which the Sinclair ministers could possibly fill, since there was some renewed migration from the Highlands of Scotland that was coming into the area in the 1820s and 30s. There was still a need for Gaelic-speaking ministers. And all of the Sinclairs, father, sons, the whole families, were from the Gaeltacht. They were Gaelic speakers, and the men who were ministers certainly could have served that need. Now in 1857, after graduating seminary, James Sinclair was looking for a job. This is James the son. He's called by Ashpole and Smyrna. You'll see the pictures there. Ashpole located down near Roland. Smyrna, you'll see the vacant lot where Smyrna used to be, down a few miles from us. And the last edifice of the Smyrna church was moved in 1989, spring of my senior year as a student here at St. Andrews, all the way up past the Equestrian Center. About 5 miles it was moved, all the way up here. It is now the Faith Congregation right next to us here, right beside Scotia Village. So in any event, James Sinclair called to Ashpole and to Smyrna, and as we'll hear later, there's a third call that comes in as well. He comes to Robeson County in 1859. In 1857. But in 1859, shortly after arrival, Mary McPherson Sinclair, his wife, dies in childbirth and leaves him with 5 young children. And I don't know why this is happening to me right now. Somebody might be able to give me some assistance. Anybody know why that's happening to me? Anyone tech savvy might be able to give me just a hand for just a moment?
Hit page down, okay? Hit your right arrow. Yeah.
Yeah, I was hitting it there. It's just, there we go. There we go. All right. Yeah, James's wife, Mary. There we are. The interesting thing about her, she's here for just a very short time. She dies in childbirth, giving birth to a young son. The son and the mother are buried out here at Stewartsville Cemetery. They are buried right next to the plot of the family of McQueens, who are a very prominent family in this area. We'll talk about that in just a moment. In 1858, there's a Presbyterian record that talks about a complaint made by the Smyrna congregation against him that's being investigated by the Presbytery. Now, I don't know exactly the nature of that complaint, but it's the beginning of many, many more controversies to come in the coming years. One of which, and I want you to think about this for a moment, just 7 months after his first wife's death, James Sinclair is married to Mary Eliza McQueen, the daughter of Dr. Edmund McQueen of Lumberton, Lumberton's first mayor, a prominent physician. He's born on the Queensdale Plantation and was located just a few miles away here, founded by his father, Colonel James McQueen, whose mother was the stepsister of the famed Flora MacDonald. Now, the McQueens were, as one writer put it, firebrand secessionists. So keep that in mind as well. Now, shortly after James's arrival in North Carolina, he learns of the need of a minister, a Gallic speaker, to serve the congregations of Barbecue, Galatia, and Longstreet. And he encourages his father to take on that mission. And so he does. And along with his son James, they fill the void of Gaelic-speaking ministers in this area. And in a letter he wrote to a friend in Scotland, which was published in the Inverness Courier, he states, "The Gaelic language is still spoken in its purity by many in these counties, Cumberland, Bladen, Robeson, Richmond, Montgomery, Moore, and Harnett. And in both of my churches I preach it every Sabbath. On last Sabbath I assisted at the dispensation of the Lord's Supper in a congregation 40 miles distant from my home, and served a table at which upwards of 150 had taken their seats, and who had not heard a sermon in the language of their native Highlands for over 10 years. Many tears were shed during the service, and many a warm shake of the hand, as only a Highlander can give, and many a blessing was bestowed on your correspondent at parting with the warm-hearted people." See here, there's still a need, still an interest in having these people out to preach. One of the interesting things is that they're not only speaking to Highland descendants. The preaching abilities of Father John and his son James were important, as they were among the last, though not the last, preachers in the language. Father John wrote several articles on the North Carolina Highland settlement for the Gaelic newspaper An Gael, published in Toronto. And in 1871, that newspaper noted that there was a subscription agent for the paper in Lumberton, North Carolina, undoubtedly son James. Father John also wrote a very important statement in one of his correspondence which alludes to his work following the Civil War. He wrote of this community, "They are strict, conscientious Presbyterians, honest in their transactions, hospitable to strangers, but greatly in love with the mighty dollar. They were very comfortably situated before the war, the generality of them being slaveholders, but the war has reduced their position very much. I have met with a number of colored people who speak the Gallic language as well as if they had been raised in any of the Hebrides. There is no Gallic preached in the Carolinas now and not likely to be in the future. I was the last Gallic minister in the North State and preached in that language for 8 years among my countrymen." Now we know that John nor James were the last, and a Baptist named John Monroe was preaching only a few miles from James's Smyrna and Ashpole congregations, and he was known to have been able to preach in the language at least until the late 1880s, as well as James Stedman Black, who is known to have preached occasionally as the need arised at Flat Branch in Harnett County and Rockfish in Cumberland. But the importance of the Sinclair family in the continuation of the story of the use of Gallic is still quite important. John and James both ended up in the American South, and in North Carolina in particular, on the eve of the Civil War. Not being native Southerners, being conservative and strict Presbyterians, as well as having formed their own thoughts and opinions about the growing tensions between North and South prior to arriving here, led to some conflicts. And this is the other, and I think the most important part of the story. James not only accepted the call as the minister to Smyrna and Ashpole in 1857, but he was also called to serve the new congregation of the First Presbyterian Church of Lumberton, which was founded in 1859. So thus he was splitting his pastoral commitments among 3 churches, 2 in southern Robeson, 1 in Lumberton proper. The Ashpole Church, which still stands today near Roland, you pass on the highway going there right outside of Roland, many of you are going to know it. That church was constructed during James Sinclair's ministry there. As the controversy regarding secession began to heat up in neighboring South Carolina, though, James Sinclair's personal position regarding this, as well as his Christian beliefs, became rather apparent to his congregations. In April of 1860, again, not very long after marrying the daughter of a very prominent pro-secession family, he was apparently feeling pressures against his own beliefs and biblical interpretations. He offers to resign his pastorates at Ashpole and Smyrna, but shortly thereafter he withdraws the offer. The session records of Smyrna Church don't exist prior to 1868. However, there have been some excerpts which have been included in the files of the Presbyterian Historical Society. Included within one of those is a retyped record from the 1861 session record of Smyrna, where a ruling elder of the church, Angus Fairley, whose stone we just resat here at Stewartville Cemetery last week, has made a complaint regarding a sermon preached by James Sinclair. On December 9, 1860, Sinclair reportedly delivered a sermon with statements that, and I quote, had given utterances to abolitionist sentiments, which are subversive of the institutions and the well-being of this country. To wit, the pastor on the above occasion declared that Abraham Lincoln loved the Negroes and was their friend and purposed to effect their pardon from slavery at some future day. It was also noted that it not only injured him as a minister of the gospel, but also in the excited condition of the public mind, subjected him to personal violence from the hands of his fellow citizens. You can imagine a lynching of a minister. A similar circumstance also apparently occurred within the Ashpole congregation during the time of secession convention in Charleston, South Carolina, where he apparently urged his congregation not to be party to the decisions which were being made in the neighboring state. Now, of course, Ashpole is located just a short distance across the state line, as was Smyrna, and there were undoubtedly residents of both of those congregations who were residents of the state that was seceding from the Union. By March of 1861, as a result of the complaints, the pastoral relationship with the Smyrna congregation is dissolved. Just a year later, in 1862, the same pastoral relationship is dissolved with Ashpole, with session records noting a complaint from Sinclair that he has not been paid for his services in several months and that the church is in severe arrears to him. Apparently, he may have still had some pastoral relationship going on with them, with the Lumberton Church, as he was living there with his wife and family by this time. However, other duties are not only going to interrupt his ministry, but these are going to be contrary to the accusations which have been made against him. Duty to country or family obligations. James's stance on abolition would likely not have stood well with his new wife's family, and the next part of the story is mysterious and intriguing. Did James perhaps ally himself with the Confederacy to appease his secessionist in-laws? Or was he only a conscript, as he later stated? You be the judge, as the story continues here. In March of 1861, James was moderating the session of the Lumberton Church, and on March 31st, 1861, preached his first sermon as the minister in charge of that congregation. He's in Lumberton now. He's away from the home of his wife's family at or near Queensdale Plantation. The presbytery has just met a few days before at that new church, and they've approved his request for a salary of at least $125 or as much as $200. And at that assembly, he is elected along with James Sprunt of Wilmington. Many of you may recognize that name as being a prominent one in Wilmington, as delegates to the Presbyterian Church's General Assembly. Nonetheless, this is just prior to the split between the Northern Presbyterians and the Southern Presbyterians, due to the war, as well as both political and doctrinal issues, precipitated by a demand by the Northern churches that all of its ministers swear allegiance to the United States. Only 5 days later, Fort Sumter is fired upon. The Civil War begins. 1 month after his first record of being at the Lumberton Church, and just a few days after being elected a delegate to the General Assembly, North Carolina secedes from the Union. James is still recorded as a session moderator for the Lumberton Church in August of 1861, as well as in April of 1862, being recorded present for that one. But a lot has happened in his life during those months. In May of 1861, James is commissioned as the chaplain of the 5th Regiment of North Carolina Troops, Confederate. The regiment's fully organized in Halifax in July and is sent immediately north, where it serves in the Battle of First Manassas, or First Bull Run, depending on your politics and which way you want to refer to that battle. On July 19th, he is under General James Longstreet's command. The regiment that he's part of is one of 10,000 volunteers called upon by the state on secession. Now, was he serving in a military capacity that would bring him into good graces with his wife's family? Or was he truly allied to the Confederate cause? Or was he simply serving in a capacity which would at least allow him not to be non-combatant in the position of a chaplain? A lot of questions. Move to the next slide. The fighting parson. On July 19th, at First Manassas, the senior officers of his regiment are both on sick leave. Several junior officers in the regiment are killed or wounded during the battle, and James reportedly rallies and leads the regiment in their part of the action after this. He is commended by General Longstreet. It's reported in the local papers that he's offered a position on General Longstreet's general staff, as well as being presented a special sword in recognition of his service. But the latter is widely reported to be an outright lie in the later histories written about the regiment, as well as in newspaper accounts. Nonetheless, he becomes known as the Fighting Parson, a nickname which he's later mocked for. So, is he hero or is he chameleon? In September of 1861, the Fayetteville Presbyterian Reporter, as well as several other newspapers, print the following advertisement. Volunteers wanted. Young men of North Carolina, your country is invaded and calls you to arms. I have established my headquarters for the president at Lumberton, Robeson County, and invite the young men of Columbus, Brunswick, Bladen, Robeson, Cumberland, Richmond, Anson, Moore, and Montgomery to rally to the flag of their country, hitherto victorious in all pitched battles, and to help drive the enemy from our borders. Your service will be accepted either for 12 months or the duration of the war. In the twofold capacity of captain in the army of the Lord and of my country, I propose to lead men under my command to victory over their spiritual as well as their temporal foes. God and country, James Sinclair, Colonel Commanding. Now, you might note of interest, all of those counties which he mentioned there, he pretty much defines the old Highland settlement region at that time. So he's looking to recruit fellow Scots for this new regiment he wants to raise. So James is not with the army in Virginia at that time, but rather he's in Lumberton at home, recruiting for the army, as well as apparently still ministering in some capacity to the Lumberton Presbyterian Church. Now, in August of 1861, the Presbytery addresses a complaint made by the Smyrna congregation that their session books are being held by an absent member of their session and not being released due to a promise made to a former minister, i.e., James Sinclair. The Presbytery orders the session records to be handed over immediately to the clerk of session and held from there with that person from that point onward. One wonders, why is he having somebody hide the session records? I wonder what those session records had in them. They don't exist anymore, apparently. In November of 1861, James Sinclair takes command of the 35th North Carolina Regiment with the rank of lieutenant colonel. And it's important to remember that officers at that time were elected by the troops. So one can only imagine, here's a charismatic man, he gets everyone all fired up and excited, he's elected colonel of the regiment there. The regiment is organized at Camp Mangum near Raleigh and to be posted to the Onslow district of North Carolina for the defense of eastern North Carolina. And among the 10 companies that make up the regiment, most are from the Piedmont and the West, but one is the Moore County Scotch Riflemen, composed almost entirely of Highland Scots second-generation descendants. In January of 1862, the regiment was transferred from state service to full Confederate Army status and was posted to New Bern. Roughly a month after the fall of Roanoke Island to federal forces, which opened up the coastal sounds and the inland port towns of North Carolina to federal capture, the Federal Army works to solidify their control on eastern North Carolina. On March 14, 1862, federal forces under Ambrose Burnside attacked New Bern. James Sinclair is the ranking officer on the right flank of the Confederate line commanding the 34th North Carolina. You see him right here. There's a small split here. There's a militia unit over here, a railroad that's running in between it there. They're receiving fire from the gunships offshore. Really a horrible place right in the midst of the end of the Confederate line there. The regiment's flank was exposed, and when the militia next to them retreated under heavy fire, it too collapsed under utmost disorder, as it was reported. The Confederate line collapses, the Federal troops win the battle. James Sinclair is almost singularly blamed for not only the loss of the battle, but the loss of eastern North Carolina to the Federal Army. As a result, the inland waterways, the sounds of eastern North Carolina, become conquered by federal forces and remain so for the remainder of the war. A court of inquiry is held within the Confederate Army, and newspapers from Richmond to Montgomery, Alabama, blast the fighting parson as a coward. as information regarding his previous ministerial troubles becomes more widely known, there's accusation of conspiracy, in addition to cowardice. Now, though Sinclair responds to these in much detail, you can find it in a number of newspapers, the Raleigh papers, the Charlotte papers, everywhere really, back and forth, extensive correspondence there where he explains the situation. But he is publicly shamed and disgraced. And though the court of inquiry, a court-martial, does not find him guilty of any misconduct, he's not re-elected colonel of the regiment when it's reorganized, and he resigns his commission from the Confederate Army, supposedly after his complaints to President Jefferson Davis go unreplied to. He blames the loss of the Battle of New Bern on drunkenness and incompetence, and it somewhat mirrors accusations which will later be made of him. His young 14-year-old son, James John, possibly Jr., has also marched off to war with his dad. He's also dismissed from the Confederate Army after his father's resignation for being underage. He returns back home to Lumberton with his dad. Jr. is later either conscripted or re-enlists, and he's captured at Fort Fisher in January of 1865. But after this debacle, the debacle at New Bern, where Sinclair has been accused of losing eastern North Carolina for the Confederacy, he returns home. In September of 1862, he is conscripted into the 58th North Carolina Regiment. He makes an official complaint to Jefferson Davis that he should not have been conscripted, as he was formerly a chaplain and a colonel in the Army, but he receives no reply. But he's released from service under a writ of habeas corpus. In October of 1862, the relationship that James had with Ashbowl Presbyterian Church is formally dissolved by Fayetteville Presbytery, though he's been absent for that church already for a number of months. The accusations against him stem from his inflammatory sermons and the fact he had not been in their pulpit for some time, but was still evidently expecting his salary, as he wrote to the session stating that they were in arrears to him. The session and congregation voted unanimously for his permanent dismissal. He makes a complaint to the presbytery, which is upheld, and some settlement for his back pay is evidently reached. In 1863, again, James is back in Lumberton, but he's out of the Army and without a pastorate. In July of that year, he petitions Fayetteville Presbytery to enter into secular pursuits until he can pay his debts. This is denied by the presbytery. In August, the presbytery begins an investigation into rumors prejudicial to the moral and ministerial character of the Reverend James Sinclair. In August of 1863, the Fayetteville Presbytery begins these investigations about the character of James Sinclair. In November of that year, and in part being without a pulpit of his own, being denied the ability to pursue non-ministerial work by our presbytery, the old Fayetteville Presbytery, he petitions to be dismissed to the Allegheny City Presbytery in Philadelphia. That's where he went to school. But Fayetteville Presbytery again denies his petition, saying that due to the fact that he is under investigation and the members of the presbytery for which he is trying to ally himself are our political enemies, the request is denied. In November of 1863, a warrant for James Sinclair's arrest is made by General Whiting of the military district of Wilmington. He's charged with being an enemy to our institutions and our government. He's taken into custody, but he's suddenly released. And it's supposed by the historian William McKee Evans that that was perhaps through the influence of his wife's McQueen family. He almost immediately becomes a co-editor of a radical Confederate newspaper, the North Carolinian, in Wilmington, where he resides and he worked for some time, writing pro-Confederate dogma, perhaps under some duress, while he's separated from his wife and his family, who are still in Lumberton. The charges that are being brought up against Sinclair are presented to Fayetteville Presbytery on April 6, 1864, and they consist of the following. from July 1862 to July 31st, 1863, that Sinclair has been freely addicted to the use of ardent spirits and visiting Lumberton public stores where spirituous liquor is sold, and there associating with others who were tippling and whose walk and conversation were such as are worldly and unholy. Second, that in the summer of 1863 that the accused did at the City Hotel of Wilmington expose himself while intoxicated. That the accused is guilty of scandalous and disrespectful conduct unworthy of a minister of the gospel and injurious in its example within the church and upon society, and also within the pale of the church. Fourth, that he had not for 12 months past followed up with the holy work to which he was ordained, but had lived in unprofitableness and levity as a clergyman, and in July of 1863 applied to enter into secular pursuits and to attend to private and pecuniary affairs. Now, in the sake of the last, you can say he's being accused of not performing his duties as a minister, but he doesn't have a charge. So again, it's somewhat confusing. He pleads not guilty to all the charges except the last, and says that his request was simply a necessity to support his family and to care for his debt. Presbytery votes to censure him. He is charged and warned to avoid for the future the exceptionable conduct for which he has been censured, and that forthwith he earnestly endeavor to apply himself to the duties of the ministry. Troubles on the home front. Due to the forced labor which has been demanded from Robeson persons of color, i.e., the Lumbee Native American population, for the building of coastal fortifications, such as Fort Fisher, which was at one point the largest earthen fortification in the world, a lot of the Lumbee males hide out in the local swamps to avoid this conscription. They're pursued for their forced labor by the local home guard. These outliers in the swamps also begin to harbor Union escapees from the Confederate prison camp in Florence, as well as deserters from both the Confederate Army as well as escaped slaves. After the murder of his father by the local home guard for harboring escaped Yankee prisoners, Lumbee Indian leader Henry Berry Lowrie begins a reign of retribution against local planters and prominent citizens. The Lowrie gang, under his leadership, begins a campaign of robbery, looting, terrorizing the local communities in Robeson County, which lasts from 1865 until 1872 with his disappearance. And though federal troops were sent back into Robeson County to restore order and capture Henry Berry and his gang, they're never successful. Of course, in March of 1865, William T. Sherman's armies marched through this area. In fact, locally speaking, the West Wing marched roughly up Highway 79 from Gibson up towards Springfield, the camp at Springfield. East Wing marched right up the old Barnes Bridge Road here on their way toward Lumber Bridge. So there were troops to both right and left flanks there. And it's reported that many of Lowrie's gang and other loyal Lumbees, Unionists, had helped Sherman's men negotiate the swamps as guides. So one might imagine now how their image is within the eyes of the locals there. There's virtual anarchy after the departure of Sherman's army, with armed terror being carried on and out among members of all races. And in April of 1865, both General Lee's army as well as that of Joseph Johnston surrender, ending the Civil War but leaving behind a huge power vacuum between the federal occupiers and the former Confederate leaders. Now, in May of 1865, the northern branch of the Presbyterian Church's General Assembly addresses the schism that's occurred during the war, splitting the denomination into North and South. The Northern Church resolves to build up the Presbyterian congregations of the now reunited South through a board of domestic missions, to readmit any ministers who profess their loyalty to the United States, as well as to the doctrines of the Northern Church's General Assembly, as well as making a special effort to evangelize and establish churches for the colored population based on professions of faith. Preaching to the freedmen here. By the summer of 1865, both James Sinclair and his father John have allied themselves with the northern branch of the Presbyterian Church. They told their Carolina friends and neighbors that their intent is to re-affiliate with the Presbytery of the island of Mull in Scotland, perhaps returning to Scotland, but that's not the case. James begins teaching to a school in Lumberton for the new freedmen, where both old and young are being instructed in the basics of reading and writing, and it's the first African-American school in Robeson County. It's reported to have had at least 93 students at one time, 1/4 of which he supposedly was able to teach how to read and write. He also begins preaching to the freedmen and persons of color, and both activities are taking place at the Lumberton courthouse, so they're likely able to continue due to protection by the local military authorities and others loyal to them. He reports that some of his congregants are beaten and whipped when their attendance at his meetings is found out. In August of 1865, James's interest in the welfare of the freedmen is recognized, and he's named the interim agent for the Freedmen's Bureau until an agent for the sub-district can be named. The agency is founded by the federal government in the occupied South to oversee the welfare and well-being of former slaves. Now, on September 16th of 1865, Giles Leach and a member of the Robeson County legislature shortly before or shortly after that time, he and a number of residents filed a petition with the military agent for the Freedmen's Bureau in Lumberton, demanding the dismissal of James Sinclair for the reason that he has been obnoxious to the people. He remains in office at least through October, as the government requests from him a report requesting the numbers, location, and status of former slaves and poor whites, a report on their camps or shanty towns established, report on information for food stuffs, schools, churches, what's available to them, as well as other pertinent information. But in October of 1865, the Fayetteville Presbytery begins catching up on old business, which may have been delayed by the war. They too begin an investigation of the certain rumors prejudicial to the Christian and ministerial character of the Reverend James Sinclair, rumors brought to the knowledge of the presbytery by common fame. The charges include gross immorality, that in 1862 that he had purchased a man of color who had been imprisoned for his cost and the cost of bail, and then later sold the man into perpetual slavery, leaving behind a wife still in Robeson. Now the question is, was this man of color, was he an African American? Was he a Lumbee? Was he a mixed race person? It's sort of hard to say, but that meant that term person of color was quite a loaded one at that point in particularly Robeson County. Second charge, that as a minister of the gospel he had openly exposed for sale and sold himself or had others sell for him intoxicating liquors. That in the summer of 1865 he had stolen a barrel of ice belonging to another man and destroyed the sale ticket proving its ownership. Fourth, that he had exposed himself to ridicule and the church to reproach, and that he is in the habit of getting drunk when he uses intoxicating liquor. And fifth, that he committed adultery in a Wilmington hotel with a free woman of color named Nettie Hammond Roberts. And again, is a free woman of color, is that an African American? Is it a Lumbee? A lot of possibilities as to who that could have been, but nonetheless, the charge is quite stinging nonetheless. And sixth, in several more specifics, he's charged with falsehood based on a newspaper account he gave of his life and struggles against the slavocracy of Robeson County and North Carolina, and his struggles against the Fayetteville Presbytery and the Confederate Army, which were published in the Presbyterian Banner in Pittsburgh on August 9, 1865. And in that article he stated that due to circumstances beyond his control, he was once a slaveholder, but he was dismissed by the Smyrna church for preaching a sermon on family religion in which he took the opportunity to warn his congregation of the dangers of following the lead of the men of the other state, i.e. South Carolina, and that due to this sermon he was denounced as an abolitionist, his life was threatened, and he was forced to take refuge in the Confederate Army. Now that's quite a jump, isn't it? Take refuge in the Army. That his current ministry to the freedmen has resulted in threats on his life, and that his congregants are sometimes beaten or punished for attending. And that the Presbytery had done everything in their power to prevent him from performing a ministry through the free blacks and poor whites now flocked to him in great numbers. But that newspaper article was the last straw for the faithful Presbytery. James wasn't present to answer his case. The Presbytery met at Barbecue Church in February of 1866. He was suspended by the Presbytery for not appearing at trial. He's away in the north, as you'll see in a moment. In 1866, James Sinclair still seems to have some affiliation with the Freedmen's Bureau, and records show him taking on at least 3 former slaves as indentures. Now, whether this is to rescue them from poor conditions or to have them serve as home laborers for him is not really clear. But a case was also brought to trial for Sinclair evidently conveying or selling a female named Edna who had been indentured to him or another party. And one asks, is this slave selling after slavery is abolished? Or is it just another accusation and a hit at Sinclair? Move to the next slide. And the slide here will show you Love Grove AME Zion Church, which is an offspring of the old Barbecue Church, which was founded by James's father, John Campbell Sinclair. He formed that church to preach to the former slaves of that congregation and reportedly preached to them both in English as well as in Gaelic until the end of his ministry there, because it was noted that many of the slaves, and the older slaves in particular, preferred to hear sermons still in that Gaelic language. So, bilingual minister founds a black church, preaches to them in Scots Gaelic. So, he is carrying on his ministry a few miles away from his son, who's having quite a bit of difficulties. On January 29, 1866, James Sinclair appears before the United States Congress as a witness in hearings regarding the status of Reconstruction efforts, particularly regarding the thoughts of Southerners regarding the rights of freedmen and the work of the Freedmen's Bureau. There's an extensive transcript of his testimony. In fact, part of this testimony, I found out, has even been used in textbooks on Reconstruction in the New South, surprisingly, by Macmillan Publishers. There's an extensive transcript available. You can find it online fairly easily. But when he's asked about the sentiments of the Southerners toward the federal government, he said, "There's generally among the white people not much love for the government. The white people in the South feel the Northerners have ruined them." He goes on to state that Southerners felt it was their right to succeed. It wasn't wrong. That they were right. They had a right to slavery, which was protected by the Constitution. That Unionists within the South generally felt that slavery was not unjust, any more so than the right to own slaves was, but their main opposition to that point was objection to the right of suffrage to the freedmen, as it would give African Americans rights at their expense. They feel that if freedmen are given rights, that they'll surely go down. He also states that whites are willing to allow freedmen to own land, but only at their disadvantage and to the profit of the white man, which will again bond him back once again to white men. In regard to the familial rights of freedmen or people of color, he says, "I suppose I've married more than 200 couples of Negroes since the war, but the whites laugh at such a thing." He also stated that there was within my own family a slave who wished to marry a woman of color, and I did what I conceived to be my duty and married them, and I was presented to the grand jury for doing so, but the prosecuting attorney threw out the case and would not try it. And maybe that might allude to the case which was mentioned earlier. He's asked another question. Can you say anything else in regard to the political condition in North Carolina? The feeling of the people toward the government of the United States. And he says, I, for one, would not wish to be left there in the hands of those men. I could not live there just now. Perhaps my case is an isolated one from the position I was compelled to take in that state. I was persecuted, arrested. They tried to get me into their service. They tried everything to accomplish their purpose. And of course, I've rendered myself still more obnoxious by accepting an appointment under the Freedmen's Bureau. As for myself, I would not be allowed to remain there. I do not want to be handed over to these people. I know it is utterly impossible for any man who was not true to the Confederate States to the last moment of the existence of the Confederacy to expect any favor of these people as the state is constituted at present. In March of 1866, William McCoy, the owner of the North Carolina Presbyterian newspaper in Fayetteville, publishes the charges against Sinclair in his newspaper. When he met up with McCoy in Lumberton, Sinclair wields a cane and a pistol against him in a street fight, which is reported in a number of regional newspapers. He is again mocked as the Fighting Parsons because, of all accounts, he lost the brawl. In April of 1866, he's convicted of all charges brought up before the Fayetteville Presbytery. He's excommunicated from the Southern Presbyterian Church. In October of 1866, he petitions to become a member of the Philadelphia Central Presbytery, despite still living in Lumberton. The Presbytery admits him despite his presentation on his own free will of the evidence that was given from Fayetteville Presbytery against him. They stated that regarding his admission that the actions of Fayetteville Presbytery were, under the circumstances, utterly null and void, and as to the charges themselves, from all the light we could gather on this subject, they were groundless and probably instigated by political and ecclesiastical hostility. So he's gone up north. They say, you were just in a bad place. We don't believe any of this stuff. You're in. Nonetheless, 2 months later, in December of 1866, the Philadelphia Central Presbytery tries him for gross immorality and falsehood after other Northern Branch Presbyterian ministers in North Carolina, likely others that are serving as missionaries among the freedmen in locations of federal occupation and things like that, that the entire population of the state is entirely satisfied of his guilt, and that having him as a representative of the Northern Branch of the church would hurt their cause. The Presbytery convicts him of selling liquor and drunkenness, but not guilty on the other charges. They suspend him from the ministry until the accused gives satisfactory evidence of repentance and reformation of life, and also recommends that he remove from the field where his present and former troubles render it almost certain that he will never, ever again be useful. But James remains in Lumberton. His fathers remained active as a minister of the Northern Church. In Cumberland and Harnett counties, he's established the black church there with his old congregation, where he still preached in Gallic. But he eventually removes to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to be closer to his daughter, who was married a local Scots minister from Pittsburgh in 1864. So, son James is left now on his own. From 1868 to 1870, James Sinclair served as a state representative for Robeson County. And among the papers that I found in doing some research, here's where he was nominated first for the Board of Elections in Robeson County. And up top here it says, Reverend James Sinclair, about 10 years he's lived in this country. He is a strong Union man. There you are, Reconstruction politics, right there. With the help of he and a man named R.K. Proctor, they organized the Robeson County Republican Party in the new administration. He, along with African-American Robert Carlyle, proved to unite the radical Republican vote, much to the dissatisfaction of the former leading whites. In 1869, he also becomes a collector or tax collector for the 3rd District under the Republican state government. Another hated position to those who were not fond of him already. In March of 1870, less than a year after taking office, he's replaced. He is, however, still serving as a magistrate and a justice of the peace in Robeson County. In 1870, the Philadelphia Presbytery deposes him permanently from the ministry because he has for the past 2 years been engaged in secular pursuits and has affirmed that it is his duty and purpose not to resume the work of the ministry. So, he's gone from the ministry into the military, back into the ministry, and now into politics. Maybe a little sales of liquor in between there somewhere, too, as well. In 1870, he again announces he's going to run for the House of Representatives, but the editor of the Robesonian newspaper says that if he doesn't win, that he'll probably get the governor to declare Robeson County in a state of insurrection, which it somewhat is, due to the Lowrie gang. Civil war, if you will, in Robeson County. Fear everywhere. William S. McDermott, the editor of the Robesonian, and Sinclair are not friends. He has him arrested on charges of contempt for writing this in his paper, and James Sinclair initiates the charges through his position as a Republican Justice of the Peace. James Sinclair's connections with the Henry Lowrie gang are noted in the testimony of the African-American gang member George Applewhite. Those of you that are familiar with the story of the Lowrie gang, he's the man that murdered Sheriff Reuben King. He was a former slave from Wayne County that joined the group. He's captured, and in his testimony in later years, he says first that Reverend Sinclair was no friend to the group. But then later he recants and said that Sinclair helped warn them of the raids against them by the local militia, as well as the federal troops sent to capture its leader, Henry Berry Lowrie. So Sinclair knew Henry Berry Lowrie. And the following account is noted in the book, The Swamp Outlaws, published right after the conclusion, the disappearance of Henry Berry Lowrie. I'll move to this, what I think is a pretty important testimony here. Lowrie, answered Sinclair, is really one of those remarkable executive spirits that arises now and then in a raw community without advantages other than what nature gave him. He has passions, but no weaknesses, and his eye is on every point at once. He's impressed that whole Negro society with his power and influence. They fear and admire him. He asserts his superiority over all these whites as well. No man who stands face to face with him can resist his quiet will and assurance and his searching eye. Without fear, without hope, defying society, he is the only man we have any knowledge of down here who can play his part. Upon my word, I believe if he had lived ages ago, he would have been a William the Conqueror. He reminds me of nobody but Rob Roy. How about that? Sinclair, this is what the man had to say in a published document about Henry Berry Lowrie. Now, whether or not James Sinclair provided any assistance to the Lowrie gang is perhaps speculation. However, there seems to be much in the way of his stances regarding people of color that might lend one to believe that it may well have been the case. Such suppositions have been made in part in works of historical fiction, and I draw attention to, and I'm sure many of you here tonight are familiar with Josephine Humphrey's book, Nowhere Else on Earth, which is one of my favorite books in the world. This is in part how I became enamored with the story of James Sinclair, because the part he's given to play in that book. He's also portrayed in the outdoor drama Strike at the Wind, which ran from the 1970s to the early 2000s in Pembroke. Now, James may not have appreciated the fact, but Henry Berry Lowrie visited the Queensdale plantation, and he stole his wife's uncle's pocket watch, Major James McQueen's pocket watch. As part of the testimony here that was given when George Applewhite recants, saying that, yes, Sinclair helped us. He warned us of all the agents coming and all, so we could all get away and not be captured. And he also tells about stealing the McQueen pocket watch, which was supposedly brought over by an ancestor, my 5th great-grandfather from the Island of Skye. So, an interesting twist in the story there. But that's all attested to not only in the Applewhite testimony, but in McQueen family lore as well. Applewhite was excused and freed through the Amnesty Act in 1873. He ends up being a progressive, though, marked as a progressive in race relations. And as you'll note here, in one of the terms of legislature, James Sinclair is asked, as it says, Mr. Colonel Reverend James Sinclair, better known as the Fighting Parson, arose and moved that the term colored be expunged as not respectful to the colored delegation. It says James H. Harris arose and said that he didn't see any good reason for the proposition. The record was literally true. God had made them colored men, and he was not ashamed of things God had done. He was not ashamed of his color, and he hoped the gentleman of Robeson was not ashamed of his. And it says the fighting parson caved in. But think about that. That's pretty darn progressive for 1870. You know, that's the sort of thing we think about in the 1970s, 1980s, that sort of thing. Expunging that sort of language. All right. In August of 1873, Sinclair's youngest son, by his wife Mary Eliza McQueen, passes away just past his 3rd birthday. He's buried in the Norman Cemetery in Lumberton. I want you to note that. Norman Cemetery in Lumberton. Sinclair was still rallying the radical Republican forces in North Carolina as late as 1876, even though he wasn't holding office at that time, but still had political aspirations. At a rally in Monroe, he was billed as engineered. The rally was supposedly engineered by the fighting parson, Colonel Sinclair. His Scottish accent is mocked. It was reported that Colonel James had slung back 6 drinks prior to the speech. And then he cursed and waved his hands and arms at the African-American audience for not cheering him properly. It was said after the rally that he was plied with even more drinks and stumbled and fell in the streets of Monroe, muddying himself. And in another account of the same radical rally published in the Southern Home of Charlotte, the following account, written in a mocking African-American dialect, stated, I'll try to give this a run. You get the idea. Side by side with Brother Hester was the fighting parson. Oh, what a wicked rebel he were. He want to eat Yankee liver for breakfast, and he go to Newbern to kill them all. But when they come with the cannon and the bayonet, religion turned he hard, and he turned back on the Yankees, and he beat the horses running. Ever since he be a loyal man and a friend of the colored folk. I think that's really, really telling right there. It's mocking him, but I think a very truthful statement. 1876, it appears apparent that Sinclair was not only a hated man, but he's probably a broken man in a lot of ways too. The newspaper accounts go on to reflect a lot of instances like this, where he came across one, it's where he's on a train and he comes across 2 ladies on the train, and he says that he's so familiar in his language and speech with them that one of them fainted. And I just, you know, I'm looking back and thinking of the scene in Gone with the Wind when Aunt Pitty Pat says the Yankees have come to Atlanta. Bring me my smelling salts, Prissy, you know, but, you know, just, again, the image there that's created, you know, within this language. There's lots of things like that which occur in the newspapers that you find them talking about this man, oftentimes with little digs, just like that. They don't make fun of his wife, but they sure do hit him hard. In August of 1877, he made yet another journey to Monroe for political purposes, and according to accounts, he lost his voice during the speech. And he died on the train journey coming back to Lumberton on August 5th. He was only 50 years old. He was buried in the Norman Cemetery in Lumberton, just behind the new City Hall. His wife, Liza McQueen, survived him for some 33 years, passing away in 1910. She was noted as a woman of grace and beauty. They talked about in a number of articles about how she was one of the most beautiful women in Raleigh, when he was serving in the state legislature, how she was so congenial, conversant on every topic, beautiful woman. But perhaps she was greatly affected by her husband's contrary beliefs and conscience, as opposed to that which she was raised in her family. James's father, Reverend John Sinclair, dies in Wheeling, West Virginia, a year after his son at the age of 81. Now, we have to talk about the epilogue now. And to me, this is really the most fascinating part of the story. I became really fired up about this topic about 5 years ago. This is a picture of my son, Daniel, and several of the boys that worked with him on his Eagle Scout project in cataloging the Stewartsville Cemetery. And I'm working through stone by stone. For years, I had seen what looked like something buried, very near the McQueen plot. You could tell it was some sort of stone. Until we got these boys with brute force and lifted these pieces out of the ground and re-erected them. That is the marker for James Sinclair's first wife, Mary. It says on the bottom of the stone, wife of the beloved Reverend James Sinclair, minister of Smyrna and Ashpole. It had steel rods in it. It was disassembled, taken apart, and buried. This is the Norman Cemetery in Lumberton. 3 years ago, one of the great-great-grand-nieces of James Sinclair went to visit the cemetery because it was recorded in the city records that he was buried here. The young son that I spoke of just a moment ago that died in 1873, his stone stands right there. There were no stones for James and Eliza. Prominent minister, woman from a prominent Robeson County family, daughter of the first mayor of Lumberton. Stones are gone, disappeared. Now, whether it was through calculated vandalism, it seems just more than coincidental that 25 miles apart these are, that all record of James Sinclair and his family, somebody may have tried to erase them from the historical record. Burying a dead wife's stone, stealing 2 tombstones. She just had this re-erected last year. This is a new marker that the family had put up, marking them. Last Saturday, I went down to the cemetery to take a better picture of it, and some of you from Lumberton are going to know all about this. There's a good number of Confederate veterans buried in that cemetery. And you can see in the picture here, I was really sort of amazed that there's a lot of the old stars and bars, the first national flag, flying by those graves. The Sons of Confederate Veterans, give them credit. They take excellent care of that cemetery, which I at one time was told was grown over. Here's a man that served as a colonel in the regiment. They don't know. There's no flag there for him. Not that he would even want one, but it's not there. All right? So, one wonders, there's that evidence. Why has he been forgotten? Here's some more evidence. The information is practically non-existent or false about James Sinclair in the histories of Ashpole and Smyrna congregations. Here is what was left in a notebook for the anniversary of that church, the 225th anniversary, postponed by COVID, held a couple of years ago. Chaplain 5th North Carolina, Colonel 35th North Carolina, dropped out of the South at New Bern. Dropped out of the South. He didn't drop out of the South. Served in the Northern Forces as a chaplain. Oh, they got the story all twisted up. Served in the North Carolina legislature, organized black church in Lumberton. Father and son broke with the Southern Presbyterian Church. Bits and pieces, but it's certainly not all the story. And one would think in the historical record of the church that stands today, that was erected during his ministry, that there would be more record of him than that. There's this minister that ministered before him. There's the minister that followed him after he was deposed, his wife's uncle. No Sinclair. No information. Not gone. It's just erased from record. Not mentioned in the printed histories. It's a big question. Big question mark. Why? Why? So, in conclusion, James Sinclair is recorded in history in some places that he might be recognized. There's no record of him at all, or his presence. Lumberton Church, just a little bit. Ashpole, just practically nothing. Smyrna, no records at all. The Smyrna and Ashpole congregations have no information about his time. There's no surviving photos of him. Even though all the rest of the family members, their photographs, plenty of photographs of all of them, not a single one exists of James. Their youngest son, buried at the Norman Cemetery. They didn't touch his stone, but Mom and Dad's, they were taken away. Maybe they at least respected the young son. So again, was it premeditated vandalism? Did somebody want to erase the story of James Sinclair from the history? First wife, again, her stone, vandalized, disassembled. And trust me, it would have taken a lot of people to do that. Let's look at one last question then. What might have happened to James Sinclair? What might explain the gradually aligning opinions and portrayals? Did the loss of his first wife and a rather hasty marriage in the McQueen family serve as maybe a spur for depression, ill mental health later in his life? Pressure of a prominent family being opposite one's own beliefs, possibly a stressor and strain. One wonders what the life might have been like between he and his wife. Loyalty to husband versus loyalty to family. Did James perhaps have some PTSD issues following the war precipitated by his exposure at the battlefront? Did that lead him to take up drinking, become an alcoholic? Or was he an alcoholic or adulterer? Or is he simply painted in those positions by political situations? Was he a Jekyll and Hyde character? Did he simply put his bets on the party which he thought might best benefit him? Or did he truly have those strong convictions which might lead him to go against the grain as strongly as this story might depict? And why didn't he just leave North Carolina? Was he forced to stay because of his wife and her family? Or was he just truly committed to passionately producing and pursuing social justice 150 years before his time? So the story still leads to a lot of questions. You get quiet for me there, Bijan. I'll tell you, it's a fascinating thing to read about this. Once again, if you haven't read Josephine Humphrey's book, Nowhere Else on Earth, it's an absolutely wonderful read. Also, To Die Game, the story of the Lowrie Band, really tells the most full story outside of this about James Sinclair. William McKee Evans was a very prominent historian. Those of you locally will know that that's Lib Morgan's brother. Lib Morgan from Laurel Hill, her brother, wrote this, and I had the good fortune of meeting him when he spoke about this book about 20 years ago down in Pembroke, and we talked about whether that family of McQueens were quite as good and important as they thought there, nonetheless. But this is a story. I think it's one that there's still a lot of questions to be answered. There's still a lot of research to be done. I think there's still a lot of information to be found. But I think this has brought out a whole lot of this information which can be questioned now. We can certainly bring this man to the forefront. We can celebrate the fact that he was, particularly here in Black History Month, he established the first school, the first churches. He was a man that was progressive. You know, when he's talking about expunging the word colored, pretty darn progressive. You've got to give the guy some credit for that. Whether he's loyal Confederate or not, who knows. But obviously the man seemed to have a heart that may have been affected by other things and other occurrences in his life. So I appreciate you listening tonight. Appreciate you being here. If there's any questions or thoughts, I again would like to thank Stan Carmichael, Judge Carmichael, for helping out with some research from the Lumberton side of things there. And a lot of others as well that have sort of given me some hints. You filled in a very important question just a couple weeks ago as to whether James actually did serve in the Lumberton Church, and we know that he did. So I appreciate that. Questions? Anyone? Be happy to discuss this with anybody. I appreciate your time tonight. Appreciate you bearing with me. It's something I'm pretty passionate about and enjoy speaking about. And I thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.